Good morning. Welcome to day 3 of the Chafer Conference 2025. It's been a great week so far. We'll see what people are saying here in about 30, 40 minutes. Yesterday we discussed the divine institutions, and today will be a continuation of this project. I'll be discussing leftist and Ruscist, post-fascist ideologies. But before we get started, I thought I might talk a little bit about how I got into this discussion in the first place. Several years ago, I wanted to be a missionary, so I became an immigrant first. I Googled free grace, dispensationalism, Ukraine, and that did not generate many hits in Google search engine. But it did call my attention to a particular ministry, James Meyer's Ministries. He's got a table in the back. Great guy. He and Phyllis have been so influential to me. They're actually in Brazil right about now. But they had a small Bible college and a church there in Kiev, Ukraine, the capital. And I wanted to be a missionary, and I thought, hey, if there's a theologically sound church and Bible college, then how about if I just move there, get a secular job, go to seminary online, and organically figure out what the needs and opportunities are there on the ground, rather than being the stereotypical American charging in and saying, here's what you need. So that's what I did. 2011, I moved there. I worked as an English teacher in a secular job, went to Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary online, eventually finished that, went to Tyndale to get my DMin. Several of the lectures, by the way, from Word of God Bible College is the name of the college. A lot of it is online currently. Much of it is in English with a translation into Russian. It was here at Word of God Bible College that Dr. Robbie Dean first introduced me to the verbiage of divine institutions. I was not officially a full-time student at the college. I was doing my master's somewhere else. There have been accusations and speculations of why it is that I was attending Dr. Dean's class. He might point out that he had a beautiful interpreter. It is also historically accurate that she and I did get married. There are accusations that the content of his class was not the top priority on my mind at the time. But as all theologians do, whenever things like this come up, I just say, well, if the Bible is silent on the controversy, so will I be. But as many of us were, I had certain concerns about things that I was seeing in the geopolitical realm. We're talking Barack Obama administration here in America, Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine. And the Bible framework was very helpful to me, especially in terms against the Russian influence in Ukraine. Of all of America's allies, nobody has paid a higher price in the fight against corruption than Ukraine has. There is a problem with corruption in Ukraine. How can there not be? They came out of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union went woke over 100 years ago, and it hasn't quite straightened out since. You can't just accept this Marxist ideology and think that you're going to come out okay. You're not. But they're doing very well at fighting corruption. I remember, around 2014, 2015, there was a little thing on social media that went viral. There was a Ukrainian that had jaywalked and got a ticket for it. And he was so excited that he got a ticket for jaywalking that he posted it on social media. Why is this exciting? Because the laws are being enforced. Yeah, I got to pay a little fee for jaywalking, but there's something really significant about actually having laws that are being put into place and actually keeping evil in check. This is a good thing. So fast forward a few years, we get into 2020 and the great pandemic that affected all of us across the world in various measures. Some of us have lost loved ones to that horrible disease. It's unfortunate. But there was another thing kind of bubbling under the surface of the political spectrum. We start seeing this slogan being thrown around, Black Lives Matter, especially surrounding the unfortunate circumstances under which Mr. George Floyd passed away while resisting arrest. It's interesting that a very edited video emerged on the internet. First time I saw this poor guy on the ground saying that he can't breathe, which is an interesting thing to say, being as how you need to breathe to talk. And then an ambulance rolls up, so I'm wondering, okay, what's up with the ambulance? Someone has to call that. You can't just like have an ambulance show up like that. So we already know it's out of context, and then unfortunately he passes away for the whole world to see. Now, I don't know a single person who says that George Floyd should have died that day. Yes, he was a criminal. Yes, he should have been brought to justice. But the fact that this is how he met his demise is quite unfortunate. And so there's a whole entire response to this with hashtag Black Lives Matter, which is a movement that had actually emerged several years earlier. Now, I don't know a single person who is arguing against this movement by saying Black lives don't matter. If you believe that Black lives don't matter, meet me in the parking lot afterwards. We will have a fist-to-face discussion about that, okay? I can say that very safely here because I know I'm in a group of conservatives and we all realize that, yes, indeed, Black lives matter. We go an extra step, though. We say Black eternal lives matter. We want to lead our Black loved ones to faith, just like all of our brown loved ones to faith and all of our white loved ones to faith, entirely regardless of how much light is reflected off of your skin or absorbed by your skin, right? So we start seeing that being passed around, and it's more than a slogan. It's actually a holistic ideology. And if you look into the Black Lives Matter, they have their own doctrinal positions, if you will. They say we see ourselves as part of the global Black family. That's interesting. Do we have a divine institution or two related to the family? Remember how when we look at the Bible, we have very distinct ideas of a family unit, which begins with the marriage and then involves the children. What I'm seeing in such movements as these is a dissolving of the family into the collective. So these are some things that started to concern me. I see a lot of my leftist friends that are non-believers. They have not yet accepted Christ, accepting, and that's to be expected if you don't have a clear epistemological framework. But what started to concern me particularly is that I had friends that have already accepted Christ, and they're starting to embrace this as well. And it's not just anecdotal. It's not just my little fringe group. So on the left here is a publication called Seeking Clarity and Unity. This was published by a rather large evangelical organization. I don't know if I'm supposed to mention its name, but they work on campuses and they do crusades there. And this particular organization is huge. It's got like over $500 million budget every year. So it's a pretty good crosscut, I think, of evangelicalism as a whole. As a missionary, I know that you wouldn't see me standing here in front of you if it wasn't for a whole team of people supporting me that are not on the stage with me right now. And that's true of every missionary across the globe, right? We've got people behind us that are supporting us financially or through prayer or through just a host of other means that we couldn't even list out. So a big organization like Cru, they changed their name. They took the name Christ out of Campus Crusade for Christ. I don't know. Don't ask me. And some folks on the inside of there who were more conservative were noticing a drift toward this wokeism agenda. And so they published this Seeking Clarity and Unity, which is a 100-some-odd page document, I believe. It's circulated internally within the organization before it was released to the public. I think it was released, November 2020. By August 2021, I was trying to look it up on their website, and it had been taken down. Fortunately, if you just Google Seeking Clarity and Unity, you can still access the original document. So around the time that I saw evangelicalism starting to go in this woke direction, woke being a term to describe leftism and the current manifestation of neo-Marxism, I started dealing with the evangelical approach to how evangelicals are syncretizing wokeism, which is an anti-biblical religion, with Christianity to form a woke evangelicalism. And I noticed that it's often done from a framework that sees the kingdom as already, and that we must grow this kingdom through acts of social justice. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So I started studying this phenomenon and writing responses. For example, on the right is an article that I wrote for the Journal of Ministry and Theology on dispensational kingdom postponement theology as a safeguard for the Edenic divine institutions. My friend Sean Wilson likes to review books, and I'm on a mission in life to write the worst possible titles, because he's always criticizing my titles, and this is one of the bad titles I'm proud of. I'm just kidding. In short, what the notion is that if we understand the kingdom as postponed, as we do as dispensationalists, then the framework for evangelical wokeism collapses. They don't have a kingdom to build through acts of social justice. And being as how wokeism is diametrically opposed to the divine institutions, we can protect the divine institutions by holding to a dispensational eschatology. So this is what's happening around the time of 2020, 2021. And there are some unfortunate cases of evangelicals becoming more theologically liberal over the instances, but I've been very, very pleased with what I'm seeing in the conservative realm of evangelicalism in responding to that issue. Sometimes I wish there was some more love. We do need to have compassion for transgender people. They are very deeply confused, but they're still created in God's image. And Jesus died for those people, and we need to reach them. But overall, I think that the conservatives realize this, and we're doing a good job. So in 2021, my family came to America just for a couple of months to do a little support raising before getting back on the ground. Earlier in 2021, there was a change of power here in America. President Biden became president. In the spring of 2021, not a lot of Americans are aware of this, but Russia started amassing troops on the border with Ukraine in order to attempt a blitzkrieg on Kyiv in spring 2021. But Biden sent some boats down to the Black Sea, and I'm not a military science expert by any means, but there is some evidence from the sphere of military science that several times whenever you stand up to Putin, he backs down. It happened in 2008 with Georgia, happened in 2021 with Biden standing up to Putin, and it went away and didn't really catch much traction here in the States. So he came to America in August 31st, 2021 with a return ticket for February 14th. Travel tip. If you get a plane ticket on a holiday like Valentine's Day, there might be a little more room. We didn't find out, though, because the tickets had been canceled. Shortly after we arrived in America, Russia started amassing troops on the border with Ukraine again. Anyone want to take a wild guess at what the difference is between spring 2021 and fall 2021? A significant factor that many geopoliticians are talking about would be the failure in Afghanistan, when America displayed great weakness. I like what John McClane said earlier in the war, before he died, before the escalation in 2022. Nothing provokes Putin like weakness. So there was a great display of weakness. And then on February 24th, earlier in February, I think around February 17th, Biden withdrew American troops from Ukraine that had been there for several years already. Not a lot of Americans know about that either. And then Russia escalated its violence against the Ukrainian people on February 24th, 2022. The The Russian military is not nearly as strong as people thought. They were driven out of the northern regions by April 2022. And while they did so, they continued several acts of massacre, murdering innocent civilians, including pictured here Vitaly Vinogradov, who was the dean of Kiev Evangelical Seminary. He was murdered in the name of Russian unity. He is a martyr not only of Ukraine, but of the faith. So the most elite forces of the Russian military attempted a blitzkrieg on Kiev, and they were defeated by unprepared and unarmed Ukrainian rednecks and city boys that picked up arms to defend their country. They were intuitive in doing that which they are designed to do, to maintain a distinction between Ukraine and Russia. Now, I'm glad that we didn't start a Black Lives Don't Matter movement. We were very wise, I think, in handling that particular form of post-fascist leftism. But I am concerned about what I'm seeing in certain circles of evangelicalism when we talk about Ukraine. While we didn't necessarily accept what the media was telling us about Black Lives Matter, I'm seeing a lot of evangelicals accept what the Russian media is telling us about Ukraine. It's being filtered through certain American sources. But it seems a lot of otherwise conservative evangelicals don't know how to think about geopolitics when it comes to Eastern Europe. By the way, I greatly appreciate the Chafer community's love and support during these difficult times. Whenever the escalation was first starting, we had family members in Ukraine who were trying to flee the genocide. It was a very difficult time for my family. And many of you were very warm in reaching out to us, and we appreciate that, and we really love you. Many people from many schools of thoughts, denominations, religions, have been very warm and welcoming to me as well as the entire Ukrainian community. There have only been a few individuals that took this as an opportunity to attack me personally. What a pitiful thing to do, truly. But these are such a minority. It's a small, the most divisive group of the Free Grace movement. Those are guys that I'm ignoring. That's not really worth messing with. I'm also not trying to develop a great plan for expediting the Ukrainian victory. I have some concepts in military science and some reasons to believe that if we do this, then we can hurry up the victory, but that's not what I'm doing here. My research is more related to worldviews, not so much military science. I'm not here to tell you whom you should vote for. There are valid criticisms of everybody on the ballot, and I realize that. I have some that I will not vote for. What I am trying to do here, I want to show you how we can use a solid Bible framework in order to refute certain political ideologies that are so diametrically opposed to the biblical worldview that we should be able to look at them and renounce them as capital H heresy. Okay? So that's the project at hand. I don't want to be mistaken as trying to go off on some rant about this politician or that. We are talking about worldviews here, all right? There are competing worldviews that are sneaking their way into evangelicalism, and if we have a proper biblical worldview, if we understand the frameworks, if we understand the divine institutions, we can refute them. So in our last talk, we talked about how worldviews worked. We looked at some alternative models, and we developed a biblical model of divine institutions. This time we're talking about post-fascism, ideas that have come out of the fascist ideology of the 20th century that have developed fascism in a way that it is still distinct from what we saw in the 20th century, but there are still elements of fascism that are present that if you remove them from the contemporary ideas, the entire framework collapses. So they're post-fascist in that sense. We're going to look at some doctrinal considerations. We'll look at the historical development of how we got here, and then we're going to evaluate post-fascism. All right, so first things first, doctrinal considerations. By way of review, not everybody was here last time, so we're going to take a quick overview of the doctrines that we're talking about. First things first, when we develop a worldview, we talk about the way things are in terms of metaphysics and epistemology. Epistemology dealing with the theory of knowledge, how we understand and interpret things. As biblicists, we hold to a biblical epistemology. That is our authoritative source of truth. From there, we can derive our metaphysics, which describes the layout of the universe. Whenever we talk about divine institutions, these are things that God has designed that deals with ontology and teleology. It's metaphysics, the reality of our universe. This is the area that I prefer to discuss whenever we talk about a political theory for the world. The top two, ethics and social-political philosophy, this describes the way things ought to be. Ethics tells us what's right and wrong. Social-political philosophy is how we deal with a society. Our ethics and social-political philosophy should be coming from our metaphysics and epistemology. The logical procession would be to build your worldview from the bottom up, understanding the Bible and the layout of the universe as described in the Bible, the way things are, and from there building your system of ethics and social-political philosophy. The unfortunate tendency that I'm seeing, even in our discussion amongst conservatives, is that the social pressure goes from the top down. Instead of talking about what the Bible demands of a government, people want to ask me, what do you think about this politician or that politician? So I hope to direct our thoughts more toward a holistic framework which is bottom up, specifically thinking about what the Bible says about these things. On the metaphysical front, we developed divine institutions. We have identified three. An aspect of a divine institution in my definition, and there are several definitions, and that's fine, would be that a divine institution is one that the man is designed to be a part of by default. These are the individual, the family, and the country. Our definition is divine institutions are social structures for the benefit of humanity, of which God designed all people to be members by default. The divine institutions are the individual, the family, and the country. About the individual, we have the doctrine of anthropology as a class of systematic theology, which is rather holistic, and we can look at the divine institution of the individual in terms of ontology. What is he made out of? What are the facets of him? As well as meta-ethics, which we can discuss in terms of responsible labor, that God put certain responsibilities on man. The family is the second divine institution, and it has two basic relationships as components. The first is the marital relationship, and the second is the parental relationship. So whenever we have a marriage, that's a family unit, and then the children that are produced from the marriage are part of that family unit as it grows, and then children from various family units can leave those units and start their own units and continue to have children and so forth. The country we looked at is being developed in the biblical narrative through two special occurrences. The first is the giving of the Noahic covenant after the global flood, and then the global dispersion at the Tower of Babel. We identified three facets of a country, being a distinct territory with a civil government to protect the people in the land. So I am suggesting to you that we use the Bible as our source for the divine institutions. And we look at this as our metaphysical and epistemological basis, our understanding of the way things are, in order to criticize and critique and tweak our social political philosophy and our ethics. Another thing to keep in mind as we look at some quotes from the post-fascist thoughts moving forward are the Chafer Theological Seminary doctrinal distinctives. I think Chafer has done a really good job of identifying key important doctrines and sticking to these doctrines as we educate up-and-coming pastors and theologians and theological hobbyists. The distinctives are literal hermeneutics, an emphasis on Greek and Hebrew exegesis, which, by the way, presupposes that the words of the Bible matter, which is a proper presupposition. But because the words of the Bible matter, that also involves inerrancy, which is a good presupposition, which comes out of the proper view of inspiration and so forth. We hold the dispensational theology, the full counsel of God's word, the sufficiency of scriptures, the comprehensive worldview based on the Bible, which is what we're talking about, especially in the frameworks here, as well as the freeness of God's grace, which is a soteriological topic. There are certain soteriologies coming out of the evangelical wokeism and Ruscism that we need to be deeply concerned about. All right, that's an overview of the doctrinal considerations. Now, let's take a look at the historical development of post-fascism. I'm noticing that the term fascist, even more than fascist, the term Nazi, is becoming a word that we're seeing in discussions out in society. And the word Nazi just means, I disagree with you, so you are a Nazi. And I think that this misuse of language is incredibly unfortunate. For one thing, it does such injustice to the actual victims of the National Socialist movement. The Holocaust was real, and we're seeing a real uptick in Holocaust denial. We're seeing a real uptick in anti-Semitism. And by just treating the word Nazi like a light little thing, oh, you like the metric system, you're a Nazi. No, not okay. The National Socialist movement was a very real thing. And I think we're doing ourselves a great disjustice by not teaching this in our schools and to our children. Okay, this is something that we need to know about. Not only does it do an injustice to the victims, but also it makes us vulnerable to repeating the same mistakes. If you don't know your history, you're going to repeat it. And I think we are seeing some unfortunate tendencies that could be replicating certain anti-Semitic and other actions of the Nazis and fascists. So we need to really talk about what that is in order to critique it and identify it in our society. It's not just, oh, you spoke a little too loudly or a little inappropriately about whatever this, that, or the other. There's actually a worldview of fascism that has come into various branches. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the historical development of post-fascism. Now, there are several branches of fascist and post-fascist thought, but the two that I want to zoom in on, I want to narrow it down to woke theology and Ruscism. Okay? There are other forms of post-fascism that we could talk about, but these are the two that I'm most concerned about as I look around evangelicalism today. And these are, by the way, broader than just theological issues, but I want to talk about the theology because this is an evangelical crowd and we need to be aware of what's happening in our ilk. So the first one is woke theology. I am defining woke theology as follows. Woke theology is a syncretism. Syncretism is taking two religions and pushing them together. Woke theology is a syncretism of Christianity with fascism, of critical theory, we'll talk about that in a bit, that sees the kingdom as inaugurated and seeks to build the kingdom through acts of social and ecological justice, as aligned with its secular counterparts. Now, to be clear, I myself am not a Kingdom Now guy, but we have several brothers in Christ who are. It is possible to believe that there is a current kingdom and still accept John 3:16. You got to be a real theologian to get John 3:16 wrong, right? If I was to guess, there are probably a lot of people in here like me who came to faith in Christ. And when we came to faith in Christ, we probably didn't have a very clear vision of the future, right? So it's possible to be a believer who's gotten confused on that matter. Now, just because we have a brother in Christ who holds to a kingdom now theology, that does not mean he holds to woke theology, okay? But you do need the kingdom now for a lot of the woke frameworks to work. So don't hear, oh, the kingdom is now, I'm building the kingdom by digging a well in Africa or something, and assume that he's woke, all right? There's more to it than that. We're going to get into that. All right, so that's our first post-fascist idea. The second is Ruscism. So the term Ruscism has emerged mostly in Ukrainian language literature to describe the ideology of the Russian side of the war. If you haven't been reading Ukrainian stuff lately. You probably haven't seen this term much. It has emerged in a couple of English publications, but the name itself is rather telling, RUS from Russia and then schism from fascism. So I have repurposed this term from the Ukrainian literature and narrowed it down specifically to certain theological aspects of the Ruscist worldview. There is more to Russism than what we're going to talk about today. I'm trying to narrow in specifically on that which relates to divine institutions. All right, so the definition is as follows for our purposes. Russism is the worldview of Russian fascism, which is characterized by a desire for a few great powers instead of many distinct countries, an emphasis on group identities over great expanses, and compatibility with the Russian Orthodox Church's interfaith mission of symphonia with the Russian state. We mentioned symphonia yesterday, looking at different Christian ideas about government involvement. We'll dig into that a little bit more. So those are the two that we're looking at. Now, the history of the new fascisms has been framed by many as coming in 4 different stages. The first is liberalism, second is communism, third is fascism, and then what we have today is what I'm positioning as post-fascism. Let's take a look at some sample texts from the previous theories. So, liberalism. Liberalism is here used to describe the classic liberalism, which came about several hundred years ago, perhaps most influenced by the Enlightenment. Liberalism is the idea that America was founded upon. When we say liberal today, we often don't mean true classic liberalism. We mean a neoliberalism, which is more of a leftism. And as we look at leftism, we can see that it's actually in quite conflict with the original classic liberalism. Liberalism kind of emphasizes the individual and his liberty. Let's take a sample text from the liberalist view of political theory. One such text would be the American Declaration of Independence from 1776, where the authors say, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men." All right, what are we seeing here? They are presupposing a creator. They're saying that this is self-evident, we don't need to defend that claim. They are also making the claim that it is the government's responsibility to preserve the rights of the individual. Okay? Rather theistic in its basic claims. I happen to like a lot of what's happening here. Now, granted, the original Constitution had a pretty serious problem with it, right? All men are created equal. However, some men are allowed to be enslaved simply by default of their heritage and the amount of light that is absorbed rather than reflected off of their skin. That is a serious conflict. And by the way, America fought a very bloody war. A lot of Americans died in defense of the right of freedom for many. This is why I'm of the opinion that Juneteenth is really an occasion for celebrating American achievement, because we finally said, you know, they've had enough. We shouldn't be doing this, all right? I wish we would have a Juneteenth for the unborn in the womb who are currently being slaughtered, right? Hopefully we'll get there. It's a fight that we need to keep fighting. So, that's liberalism, all right? I happen to think liberalism is a good idea. Let's compare that to the next one, which is communism. Now, communism came about. Karl Marx is kind of considered the father of communism. One of the results of liberalism is this idea of capitalism, And capitalism emphasizes free market enterprise, and whenever you have that, you have a lot of great wealth increasing. I tend to see that as when people honor the divine institution of the individual, which includes responsible labor, God blesses that. It's how God designed us. Unfortunately, not everybody becomes equally rich, and so the communists took a look at that and said, well, there is a difference between rich and poor here, so we need to make everybody equally poor. Well, that wasn't actually their intention, but it certainly is the result. Let's take a look at a communism sample text. Here we have Karl Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of the right. He says, of religion, it is the opium of the people. The higher nobility is struggling against the monarchy, the bureaucrat against the nobility, and the bourgeoisie against them all, while the proletariat is already beginning to find itself struggling against the bourgeoisie. If you'll notice, whenever you read Karl Marx, he is developing an economic theory which sees the world through the lens of oppression. Okay, that's his basic epistemology. It's his basic metaphysics, that there are two classes, rich and poor, and the rich oppress the poor. Now, communism has failed every time it's been tried. The first serious attempt of communism was in the Soviet Union. In 1917, we get the whole Bolshevik Revolution. It's a whole thing. Read the Wikipedia article. And they attempt to put in the practices of Marxist communism, sort of a Leninist Marxist idea, which sees the rich and the poor as the basic lens for discerning oppression. That's falling apart in Russia and the entire Soviet Union, which extends beyond Russia. And so there are some philosophers in Germany who started looking at that, saying, okay, we need to adjust our idea of Marxism. So they develop it from an economic theory to a social theory. The idea being, maybe we're doing this wrong. Maybe communism isn't enough. Maybe it's not enough to say we have rich and poor. Maybe we need to identify several groups that are oppressing each other. The rich oppress the poor, men oppress the women, this race oppresses that race. So there are several critical groups that are oppressing each other. It's not just a matter of finance. So this idea of critical groups develops as critical theory, and that's the basis for several sub-branches of critical theory. Critical gender theory deals with the oppression of genders. Critical race theory is the oppression of races, and so forth. We can take a look at a couple of basic texts from this worldview. Vladimir Lenin said, a Marxist must be a materialist, that is, an enemy of religion. And he's doing all this on the grounds of class struggles, whereas Max Horkheimer, from the critical theory worldview, says Christianity is not primarily used as a religion, but as a crude transfiguration of existing conditions, trying to position Christianity now as a oppressor in and of itself within the critical theory framework. All right, so that's how communism came about. Now let's look at the shift toward fascism. So communism is still failing everywhere that it's being put into practice. And the idea of communism on a governmental level is that we need to focus on society and the community, right? Dissolve personal property so that we're all one collective. The fascist idea came about. The father of fascism really was Giovanni Gentile, who lived from 1875 until his assassination in 1944. When you look at his writings, whenever I read Gentile, I'm like, ugh. This is the classic philosopher, blah, 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 Italian history, this, that, and that, and that. But Benito Mussolini is a guy who managed to express Gentile's idea in a way that politicians do, right, for the masses that everybody loves. Let's take a look at some of Benito Mussolini's ideologies that he's putting out, which are very heavily influenced by Gentile. Anti-individualistic, Mussolini says, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state, which stands for the conscious and universal will of man as a historic entity. All right, so he's saying that the individual needs to be aligned perfectly with the state. Do you see the dissolving of the divine institution of the individual in favor of the governmental aspect of the country? His idea, he says, is opposed to classical liberalism, which arose as a reaction to absolutism and exhausted its historical function when the state became the expression of the conscience and will of the people. Liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. See the emphasis on the state here and its conflict with the divine institution of the individual. He continues, the fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of all people. Do you see how fascism is a holistic worldview here? It deals with the spiritual as well as the political. We're talking on that fundamental level of epistemology and metaphysics here. Mussolini says, no individuals or groups, political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, social classes are outside the state. Fascism is therefore opposed to socialism, to which unity with the state, which amalgamates classes into a single economic and ethical reality, is unknown and which sees history as nothing but the class struggle. So we see the difference here between the critical theory and the communism that sees everything through the windows of oppression. This is taking that idea, it's the basis of the idea, but it's developing it further and emphasizing the state rather than the struggle. So what exactly is the criticism of socialism here? It's not that the economic theory is faulty, but that it lacks a full application through straight force. This, by the way, is from the document, The Doctrine of Fascism, which he wrote in 1932. Now, would you look at this and say this is rather at least anti-American, if not anti-biblical? Would we anticipate that this is the kind of thing that Americans would naturally push against? Right? Wrong. You're familiar with Will Rogers, kind of an interesting personality from that time in America. He used to say, I never met a man I didn't like. Very positive guy. Not everybody remembers that Will Rogers actually met Benito Mussolini, and he wrote about him in several publications. Here's one in New York Times when he says, I get a kick out of Mussolini. And then he defends him and talks about how he's a great guy. In 1927, he said, Mussolini is the smartest guy in the world. We know anybody who speaks in hyperboles like that about dictators these days? It's interesting. 1929, Will Rogers wrote, he has done more things for his country since the war than any 100 men in any other country. 4 years later, Will Rogers said, Mussolini could run this country with his eyes shut. In fact, that's the way our Congress has been running it. Mussolini, with no money, no natural resource, no nothing, has kept his country going, while us, with a surplus of everything under the sun, are mangy with representatives and liberty. But we can't digest either one of them. So Will Rogers was promoting very pro-Mussolini propaganda here in America, and there was actually quite a following of Mussolini in America during the days when his dictatorship was starting to rear its ugly head. Americans are vulnerable to fascism if we don't understand the holistic ideology of it. Of course, that's not the only form of fascism. There's also a National Socialist movement, which a lot of Americans actually opposed fighting against Hitler in the earlier days of the war. We shouldn't get involved. It's interesting, I've seen a recent increase of popularity of Americans returning to this, saying America should not have gotten involved in World War II. That's way over there. Now, do you think that we would have been better or worse for allowing World War II to run its course and continue with the destruction of so many lives of people who bear the image of God? It's generally accepted prior to 3 weeks ago that it's a good thing that America got in and involved. Now, when we look at the World War II situation, we often frame this as a conflict between the communists and the Nazis. The communists having their whole entire thing with class, Nazis having their whole thing with race. But that's just the socio-political philosophy. That's just the icing on our four-layer cake. What's really going on down below? In reality, if we look at the metaphysical and epistemological basis for it, what do we see? It's Marx, it's Darwinism, right? These are two sides of the same coin. They're killing each other very violently. They're criticizing each other. There are distinctions between the two ideas, but fundamentally they are much more similar than they are different. And I would submit to you that today, the conflicts that we're seeing with Russia and its aggression against the West, while there's plenty to criticize about the leftists in the West, they're working off the same basic framework. Now, it's interesting. If we read the people that are promoting Russian ideology today, for example, we have Paolo Pizzolo, who wrote his dissertation on defending Alexander Dugin, the philosopher we'll look at here in a bit. He's a Ruscist ideologue, and he speaks of fascism as having a premature disappearance in 1945. The idea being that, well, we defeated fascism and we never let it really get its fair day in court. We need to kind of bring it back and let it work its way out. By the way, I think it's also interesting that people assume that Russian ideology is so at odds with our liberal institutions when we have Paolo Pizzolo here who did his dissertation in Rome, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Jagiellonski Universitet in Krakow, Poland. I think it's interesting that we're seeing Russian ideology being developed in the University of Warsaw, at Yale, at Notre Dame here in America. Nobody is saying that these are conservative institutes. Why are we pretending like Russism is somehow a conservative ideology? It's not. So, the move from fashion to wokeism and Russism. Now, I'm distinguishing between two forms of post-fascism. The first is wokeism, the second is Russism. We've looked at woke theology already. We're defining it as that syncretism of Christianity with the fascism of critical theory that builds the kingdom through acts of social justice as defined by the secular counterparts. Now, if you're doubting that we are seeing a connection between those fascist quotes that Benito Mussolini put out and some of the modern forms of leftism, there's a video that kind of went viral a few years ago that I recommend watching. You can get it on YouTube. This channel, GOP War Room, which doesn't sound very aesthetic in my opinion, but whatever. You know, they posted a video which was played at the Democrat National Convention back in 2012, in which they say, the government is the only thing we all belong to. Do you see how that is very much aligned with what Mussolini was saying? Now, there may be some differences between Mussolini and Barack Obama. Obviously, there are. I would much rather Barack Obama than Mussolini, but I'm not going to vote for either of them. But this is an idea that is inseparable from its fascist past. Okay, if we remove this bit from the ideology, it is so core to the way of thinking that the whole entire system would kind of collapse. Do you see where I'm getting at with that? So how did we come to this? How did we end up with a significant party in America that says that we belong to the government? Well, let's follow the history, right? We have the old communism, Lenin-Marxist thought, which develops in the Weimar Republic as a matter of critical theories and critical groups. That developed further into the National Socialist world. It was only a matter of time before national or critical theorists started to identify a particular race as oppressing the others. The Jews are the most famous, as well as the Romani and several others. That was combined with the idea that maybe we need to focus more on the state rather than the critical groups themselves, hence the National Socialist movement. But it continued to develop even after the what the Russists call premature collapse of fascism in 1945. A couple of significant developments are first intersectionality, as well as the obsession with sexual issues as part of critical groups and critical theory. So what is intersectionality? How does this work? The notion is that each of these, gender is a basis of a critical group, as well as sexuality, as well as race, but they all intersect so that a person can be a member of several critical groups that are oppressed at any given time. Pamela Lightsey, who is identified as an African-American queer lesbian womanist scholar, her words, not mine, says the disenfranchisement of women intersects with the disenfranchisement of black men, of poor people, etc. The disenfranchisement of black lesbian women intersects with the disenfranchisement of transgender women, and so on. So it's a matter of finding how you're a part of several groups and how other groups might intersect with your group and how we should all be together in a way that you can grow your oppression so it's not just a matter of rich and poor. Right? Susanna Cornwall, in the book Controversies in Queer Theology, says, questions of sex and questions of race are always inextricably related. I focus on the gender and sexual issues here because we see an attack on which divine institutions? First, the individual, by trying to tamper with God's design for gender identity, as well as the family for trying to tamper with the nature of marriage. Phyllis Tribble is a feminist theologian who says no woman can serve two authorities, a master called Scripture and a mistress called feminism. Now, I actually agree with Phyllis Tribble on this point. We cannot have both. Where I would disagree with her is I would encourage you to stick to the Scriptures rather than the critical feminist theory. And it just gets worse. Here's another one. In short, a critical feminist theology of liberation names theologically the hierarchical bondage of /men in Western society and church. We always got crazy spelling, right? You got to edit out the O in the word theology, kind of like you have to take out a vowel in a cuss word if you quote it in person in an article or something. You know why, right? Why is theology a bad word? It's based on theos. And that's masculine. And so she says the hierarchy cannot be toppled when the basis or bottom of the pyramid, hierarchical pyramid, which consists of the exploitation of multiply oppressed women, becomes liberated. The idea being the mission, the missiology here, we have to topple the current world order, which is hierarchical, meaning it's patriarchal and men are running it all and trampling women underfoot. I think it's interesting, though, that if you look around the world and look at parts of the world where Christianity is more normalized, you look at parts of the world where perhaps Islam is more normalized, and we look at how women are living here and living there, it should come as no surprise that the women in more Christian areas are doing much better. It's because the Bible was given to us by God, who loves women, created women, and see women in his own image. Islam was invented by a pervert, a pedophile and a warlord who did not see women that way. Lisa Isherwood wrote a chapter called Feminist Christologies in the Blackwell Companion to Jesus, which is a liberal, very liberal handbook. Lisa Isherwood herself is a feminist theologian. She wrote a book. The title is rather telling, The Fat Jesus, Feminist Explorations in Boundaries and Transgressions, trying to put weight in as a critical group. So she points out some of the Christological heresies that are coming out of this. She says, it may be the very fabric of Christianity that caused the exclusion of women. She says, if Christ could not experience being female, then the question arose to whether the female state could be redeemed. Redemption, then, within feminist Christology is about liberation. It involves the struggle against oppression, as well as the struggle for personal integrity and human freedom. It's about wholeness and transformation. Do you see what happened to the soteriology? It's not about saving individuals from hell. It's about liberating people from alleged oppression. This gets pushed further beyond the feminist question into queer theologies. Queer theologies undo traditional theology by deconstructing it. It's a big buzzword these days, by critiquing the patriarchy and heteronormative assumptions at play in its production. Queer theologies liberate Christianity from the bondages of patriarchy and heteronormativity. Of course, it's not just about queerdom, it's not just about feminism, it can be involved with race as well. the Brown theologian. So Brown theology deals with the liberation of brown people, as Black theology deals with the liberation of Black people, and so forth. René Padilla says that the mission integral is the mission of the whole church to the whole of humanity in all its forms, personal, communal, social, economic, ecological, and political. This is Brown soteriology, a Latino view of salvation. You see how it's getting further and further away from salvation from hell, and it's becoming about salvation of society, salvation of the ecology, saving the planet from pollution. You do more for growing the kingdom by picking up litter than you do telling people about Jesus. Rebecca Volkel wrote a book called Carnal Knowledge of God, Embodied Love and the Movement for Justice, which is another queer theology text. She says, eschatology is not primarily concerned with what lies beyond death and outside of history. I agree. Our eschatology informs us of much more than the future. It tells us how to live now. Eschatology is practical and vital hope for the world as it is right now in which we are participating. This here and now eschatology fits well with a liberation, feminist, and queer understanding of eschatology. So she's saying that we have to align ourselves with the inaugurated eschatology, with the idea that we grow the kingdom through social and eco-justice. Elsewhere, we see her trying to bring in Russia's war on Ukraine and Israel's attack on the Palestinians and the earthquakes in Turkey. Any oppression under the umbrella needs to be seen through this lens. Now, not everybody is reading liberal theologians like Rebecca Volkel, but I think everybody in the West is getting the leftist media shoved down their throats, and they're seeing this kind of stuff reflected, right? So we're seeing people complain, oh, Black Lives Matter and everything. Oh, okay. And then we see the same people saying justice for Ukraine, and it gets very confusing. So let's take a look at the Ruscist ideology. Russism is the worldview of Russian fascism, characterized by multipolarity and great powers. There are two key figures in National Socialist thought that need to be discussed. The first is on the top. His name is Carl Schmitt, and the second is on the bottom, Martin Heidegger. These are very prominent members of the National Socialist Party. You can read their Wikipedia pages. Carl Schmitt wrote a book called Political Theology, in which he developed an idea called Grossraum in German, meaning big space. His idea was that we need to dissolve or expand borders between countries into giant land masses, into a great space, a Grossraum. Martin Heidegger is another party member who developed an ontology of being called Dasein. Now, the reason that these two come into the picture are because of this man, Alexander Dugin. He is the Russian philosopher. He's been called Putin's philosopher. He's the guy that basically forms the worldview for Russia's war against Ukraine. And by the way, it's not just a war against Ukraine, it's a war against the entirety of the West. And Dugin basically builds up the history of his post-fascist idea. He says the subject of communism was class, fascism was government or race. Liberalism, the subject was the individual. And finally, we outline the deepest ontological basis of what he calls the fourth political theory. Notice how he goes to the basis of the way things are, ontology, metaphysics. That is to say, Martin Heidegger. So he lays out the history, as we already have, and specifically the point that Martin Heidegger brought in was a point called Dasein. And he describes Dasein as the enemy is the one who possesses the essential threat to the existence of the peoples and its members. The enemy is not necessarily the outside enemy. The requirement is then to find the enemy, bring him to light, or even to create him. So in Heidegger's National Socialist environment, one of the enemies would be the Jews through the course of the various anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Those are the guys, we need to identify them and wipe them out, right? That's basically what Dugin is appealing to, the Dasein concept of identifying enemies from within. He combines that with another National Socialist thought from Carl Schmitt, the doctrine of great spaces, that's the Grossraum. It's not only an analysis of trends, but in the history of the continent, but also which but also as a project of future unification, which Smith considered not only possible, but preferable and even in some ways necessary. Remember the giant call, we need to unite the Rhineland, right? A giant unification of the great land masses. This is what Alexander Dugin is calling for, a return to the National Socialist idea that we need to unite the great spaces, including Ukraine, and push out the enemies that are different from us from within. In his book, The Philosophy of War, Dugin says, the continental thinking of the genius German jurist Carl Schmitt allows us to outline the circle of ours and not ours on the level of the mainland. Do you see how this is a conflict with the concept of the country? Rather than having the distinct country, we need to unite a giant landmass. The enemy on which the strategic, geopolitical, economic, and strategic levels appears for Europe, Russia, and Asia. This enemy is the United States of America, together with their island ally, England. So when was this written? Was this written in like 2024, after the escalation of violence in 2022? No, earlier than that. Was it written after 2014, after we already saw the conflict in Ukraine? Is that when America became Russia's enemy? No, it was before that. No, this is something that he wrote in 2004, over 20 years ago, all right? America has been identified as Russia's enemy for decades, and this is not the first occurrence. And we need to keep this in mind, that as an American, Russia is your enemy. So his notion is that we need to move toward multipolarity. Instead of the individual countries, we need to move to something sort of like this, which can then be expanded into something like that, or maybe even fewer and fewer poles, so that we have an approach toward globalism, but not fully globalist. There's a misunderstanding about the left. A lot of people are trying to say that World Economic Forum, for example, is globalist. I encourage you to go to their website and type in globalism in the search bar. You'll see that there are no hits really prior to until after the COVID-19. Globalism was a discussion back in 2018, 2019. But if you search multipolarity, that's the buzz term, right? That's what World Economic Forum is moving for. So what the left in Europe is doing with the World Economic Forum, moving toward multipolarity, that's the same thing that we're seeing with Russia. After the escalation of violence to a full-scale invasion, Putin said, this is the beginning of a transition from the liberal globalist American egocentrism to a truly multipolar world. See how Russia and the left are trying to do the same geopolitical thing there. And we see it all the time, right? Whenever we look at the events that happened in West Africa and where Russia was involved, it aligns along the lines of ethnos, following Dugin. Several have pointed out that the alliances that Putin is forming align very well with the future Gog-Magog war. This is interesting. Satan doesn't know when this will happen, so there's a theory that he's constantly got someone on deck in Russia. Something that's not a very effective argument in defense of Israel, because we're seeing Russism become increasingly anti-Semitic. We see people making this point, that Israel is this little blue dot in the giant sea of green Islamic states. In the normal way of thinking, we would say that's not the problem. In the multipolar way of thinking, which is what Putin and World Economic Forum are doing, they're saying, no, this should all be one giant Grossraum with the Islamic die sign. So we need to get rid of Israel and allow that to be an Islamic area. It's very pluralistic. On a final note regarding the pluralism, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow has come out regarding the war in Ukraine. He said that basically anyone who dies in the war against the West will have washed away their own sins. So if you hear any rumors about Russia being a Christian country, do not mistake Russian Orthodoxy for Christianity. All right. We looked at the historical development, and we could evaluate this through the lens of Chafer Theological's doctrinal distinctives, as well as the individual, the family, and the country. But I think we hit those points along the way. Do we have a little time for questions? Or okay. Now, before we open up the forum to discussion, I want to recall this image, right? As we have said before, the social pressure tends to be from the top down. What do you think about this president, that president? I would like to encourage us as biblicists to try to focus the direction on the bottom up. So if you have a question about what we should do about this or that or the other, let's try instead to think about the actual ideologies at hand. Okie dokie. All right.
Paul, that was a lot. Thank you.
Thanks.
I was in my notes. I was wondering if you could help me summarize the way you go. I know it's historically, chronologically from Marxism to fascism, but is there more than chronology? Maybe I just didn't catch it. Can you reinforce how fascism arrives out of Marxism?
Sure. So they're both coming out of this fundamental rejection of biblicism and liberalism, right? The communist idea was that we have two groups, one oppressing the other, and it was put on that economic spectrum. It's just the rich and the poor, basically, was the big emphasis. Then the following idea was to expand that into many critical groups. It's not just the rich oppressing the poor, it's the Jew oppressing the true Aryan race, it's the man oppressing the woman, and so forth. The shortcoming that Gentile saw with that is that it's not working, and it's obviously not working because there's so much suffering happening in the Soviet Union, for example. So why is it not working? And his proposal was not that the economic theory in Russia was fallen, not necessarily that the expansion into multiple critical groups following the Frankfurt School was wrong. Rather, it was the method for putting it into practice. The idea in communism was to kind of move toward dissolving the government so that we're one big, happy community, sharing resources back and forth and so forth. That doesn't seem to be working, so his thought was maybe we shouldn't move toward that sort of utopia. Maybe instead we need to emphasize the state so that the communal property doesn't get dissolved into nothingness, but rather it gets moved into the state so that the state controls all of the property. And the state is able to work on behalf of the individual interest because the individuals need to be dissolved in their mentality toward the state. Does that follow? Okay, great.
One more question. Time for one more. John. Prior to the most recent conflict that's occurring in Ukraine, have you seen an uptick in anti-Semitism across the country?
That's a good question. So I've seen a anti-Semitism bump up just about every time in recent years when Americans have been pushed to think about socio-political issues more seriously. I think the reason fundamentally is that Americans are not bent on a scriptural approach to these issues. So we saw it first, I think, with the stuff that was happening around 2020, really even before that. When Donald Trump became president, there was a lot of pushback coming from the left. There was a bit of an uptick in anti-Semitism then. Then, of course, as we get into more critical theory thought during the 2020 havoc, that was an uptick. But the greatest extension of that I've seen within evangelicalism, which is kind of the sphere where I tend to think we can make the most impact, has been specifically with the rise of post-millennial thought, which has happened remarkably since 2020, when people have started thinking more in terms of social-political thought. And post-millennialism itself has had kind of a sub-branch coming out of it, most remarkably with a guy named J. Rogers, who is taking fourth political theory, the Ruscist idea, and saying, look, guys, we can use this worldview as a way to build the kingdom, doing basically the same thing that our woke friends are doing for a woke theology of justice, but applying it instead to the other side of the coin, which is the Ruscist idea that we can build the kingdom through expanding these territories and making giant land masses that are Christian in theory. It's a deeply anti-Semitic idea, and we're seeing it there. So, thank you, Paul. Thank you.